Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final symposium. Thank you so much for so many turning out. I have to say we were rather worried having the final slot in Cyprus that we would have a small audience, but we have a large one. So thank you very much for that. This event, I think, is important for the EAA. It's not just a symposium, it's the launch of a new committee of the EAA. Working in what we believe, and we hope you believe, is a really important area of development and growth in accounting research and accounting policy. So the EAA has a committee for financial reporting, which engages with the standard setter, the IASB. It doesn't until now, or didn't until now, have an equivalent committee for non-financial reporting or sustainability reporting, or whatever you like to call it, integrated reporting, etc. So the purpose of this panel is, in part, to introduce the new committee, which Begonia will do at the end, but also to highlight the type of research that we hope the EAA community will be engaging in this space. There's a degree of urgency, I think, about this. It took accounting standards, financial reporting standards, decades to develop after the Wall Street crash to the very highly evolved state they are in now. We don't have decades for reporting in this domain to develop. The issues are too pressing for that. So there's a degree of urgency, and I'm delighted that we have such a great panel here to talk about these things. I won't say anything more by way of introduction other than just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do. We'll start with Mario, who's going to give us an overview from a stakeholder perspective, something of the landscape of corporate reporting in this space. We'll then switch to two scholars who've contributed a great deal to the research in this area, Carlos and Charles, who Carlos will give a broader overview, Charles more of a deep dive into a particular research area. And then Begonia, as the chair of our new committee, will introduce the work of that committee and ways in which you can get involved. Okay, without further ado, Mario, it's all yours.
Thanks, Richard. And Richard and I didn't plan to coordinate our clothing today, but we've happened to do that quite well. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a real privilege. My name's Mario Bella. I'm from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Sorry, I'm just looking for the clicker. So I'm the Director of Redefining Value at the World Business Council and also a PhD student. So I'd like to start with really providing some context about what we're trying to talk about here today. And I want to raise what I call the reporting fallacy, because legal scholars now are fairly unanimous around the world that the purpose of the corporation is not to generate short-term profits. And unfortunately, a lot of our accounting research and accounting thinking starts from this assumption. And that assumption is just wrong. And talking to businesses every day, as I do, they tell me that's wrong. That's not the way they think about their business. And so it has implications for transparency and accountability and how we really position non-financial information. Because this information isn't there any longer just to elucidate what's in the financial statements. It's covering all sorts of things, from gender pay gap to environmental issues, a whole range of issues that are disconnected from the financial statements. So to quote Indira Gandhi, who said, "We do not wish to impoverish the environment any further, yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people. Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters?" And the point she was making back in 1972 is that we can't think about these issues in a compartmentalised sort of way. They all intersect, and we need to start thinking about those intersections. And really that's the whole purpose of non-financial reporting. For those of you who like a little bit of philosophy, this is a quote from Karen Barad. I'm not going to try and read it because she writes in the most complicated English that I think is physically possible or humanly possible. But basically what she's saying, and a lot of postmodernist philosophers are saying, is a lot of the binary distinctions we make are artificial. There is nothing that actually separates financial from non-financial. It's just because the accounting profession has audited and standardised the financial bit, and the other bit has been kind of demoted to the non-financial. So what Karen says is that a lot of these distinctions we make are distinctions, they're agential cuts. We make these divides between the corporation and society. These divides don't exist in nature, they don't exist in the world out there. So I want to introduce you to somebody I detest and somebody I admire a lot. So Milton Friedman really is the architect and the proponent of a lot of the thinking that pervades a lot of our models today, which is that business, you know, the theory of the firm. We just think about the firm maximises profits and externalises a whole lot of stuff, and that's for governments to sort out. And that's been the dominant narrative for the last, 3 decades more, last 50 years actually. That's been the dominant narrative. And that narrative is wrong. Businesses do not exist in isolation. And so accounting for them in isolation is just plain wrong. And if we don't get that, I think there's no point doing research in this space, because you need to think about what's that research for and how is it kind of helping humanity. So that's a kind of fundamental point. So this is Friedman and this is Freeman. So Freeman, some of you may know, has been talking about stakeholder theory for a long time, and he says we need a new story for business. This idea that business exists just to make profit is wrong, and he's not a socialist. He's somebody who wants to make capitalism much more efficient. So that's where he's coming from. So last week I was in India, and this is Dharavi, the largest slum in India, and these are the conditions that some people on this planet live. And so we can't ignore, if we're in business, sitting in Wall Street, trading our shares, we can't ignore that this is how half the population in India live, and in many other countries as well. I mean, we can't keep closing our eyes to these facts. So to help you, at the WBCSD, we have built something called the Reporting Exchange, and it's a repository. It's free, it's open access, and it has reporting requirements across 71 countries. And I'm going to move through this fairly rapidly. It's been crowdsourced. We've built it with all these partners, many names that you will know. So, when we look at this non-financial space, there's 112 subject areas. 112. It's massive. There are over 1,000 reporting requirements. Now get this, just think about this. There are 198 frameworks. 198 frameworks. For financial reporting, we have one framework, maybe two if US GAAP it's not that separate, but anyway. And 80% of this 80% of these requirements are mandatory. So this idea that this is all voluntary and companies can do what they like and choose whether or not to report is no longer the case. I'm not going to go through this slide because I'm going to run out of time, but you can see the pattern across the world in terms of a lot of these requirements being mandatory, and also increasingly they're coming into the mainstream financial report. So we tried to clean up this mess, and so I'm going to skip through this. We decided to build an ESG library of indicators. So all the indicators under all the major frameworks are now catalogued in the reporting exchange. So if you want an indicator for accidents, you can go into the reporting exchange and you can get all the indicators under all the different frameworks. So this is very quickly how we did our kind of sifting exercise. We took these as the main frameworks. Those in this space will be familiar with, GRI, SASB, CDP, and of course in the bottom corner there, Wiki. So when we went through all of these, we found 4,607 indicators. That's a really big number. We got that number down to 1,424, which is still a mind-numbing number. But basically, once you take out all the duplications and the ones that don't require very specific reporting of indicators, you get down to 1,424. And then we classified the indicators in terms of environmental, social, governance, and financial. And actually, the only place we found a lot of financial indicators was in the Wiki framework, and the work that's been done by Wiki on that, and increasingly SASB as well as their standards. So you can see the process. The majority of the indicators are financial, environmental. There are some social, and yet governance, which investors tell us is their number one thing that they're looking for, is still an area that is very underreported. So we still have an issue there. So that's the address for the reporting exchange. Please register, log in. It's a resource for researchers. It's a resource for companies, because companies have said to us, and we work with the largest companies on the planet, we can't deal with this mess. This landscape is so complicated, we can't deal with it. And work we're doing with the IAASB, looking at providing assurance on this information, is finding the problems of actually assuring often what is made up by the company. So they make up their own indicators. So it's not just the thousands that we've seen that I've put up there. That's what's in the frameworks. On top of that, companies create their own indicators. So we're actually in a space that is completely non-standardised. And so that presents, I think, some enormous issues methodologically for researchers and the methods they apply in trying to move into this space and conduct meaningful research. So I think I'm just about out of time, so I will hand over to my next presenter, Carlos.
So, good afternoon. I'm Carlos Larrenaga. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me for this symposium. This symposium is addressing the so-called non-financial reporting, something that is described as a new area of information for organizations and stakeholders. And I would like to provide a little bit of context for that. In fact, I will locate non-financial reporting in historical context, in the context of sustainability, and in the context of the Anthropocene. During my presentation, I will also provide some indications to what I think the role of the accounting academia is in non-financial reporting. So this is the outline of my presentation. To begin, I'm not sure that non-financial reporting is so new. Back in the 70s of the last century, there were already discussions about non-financial reporting and stakeholder accountability. A few examples are the International Standards of Accounting and Reporting Working Group of the United Nations, the French regulation of the Bilan Social, and the discussions in the UK generated by the corporate report and the plans to regulate the value-added statement. Even in the inaugural issue of the Journal Accounting Organizations and Society, in the very first page, Professor Hopwood affirmed in the inaugural editorial that current social, environmental, and political developments are focusing increasing attention on the wider accountability of organizations. A great deal of the consequent work on social accounting, social reporting, and social auditing may be embryonic. He followed the awareness of ecological problems in drawing attention to the necessity of developing accounting system which can report on organizations' use of scarce resources, and he continued the disclosure of accounting information to employees and trade unions, for example, is now codified in the legislation of a growing number of industrial nations. That was in 1976. Even in the European Accounting Association, there has been a tradition of social and environmental accounting research, recognized in a specific category of submissions, and I note that symposia on these issues have been organized from time to time. For example, I can mention the symposium held in 2002 in Copenhagen under the title Reporting on the Sustainability, the Environment and the Social, in which I had the opportunity to participate. And this was not the first and not the last on this issue. So non-financial reporting is the last label that this activity has received, probably because of the directive on non-financial information disclosure. I find that the fact that this activity keeps changing, the name is probably caused by the maturity of the area, by probably the blur nature, the blurred boundaries between concepts, and because of the new researchers adopting the new name, the last name given by the last institutional development. I prefer the less fancy social and environmental accounting, but similar activities have been called sustainability accounting, CSR reporting, ESG, integrated reporting, and non-financial reporting. So now I will review the main concepts of sustainability which is the sustainability situation, providing context to non-financial reporting. So sustainability, sustainable development has been defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This was the definition coined by the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, in 1987. This definition has social dimensions because sustainability implies meeting the needs of the present. It means meeting people's needs. If we have a look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, goal number 1, no poverty, and goal number 8 is decent work and economic growth. That means that a world with 800 million people living in extreme poverty, a world in which there are more than 40 million people under slavery condition, is unsustainable. This definition has also an ecological dimension because sustainability requires not compromising the ability of future generations to satisfy their own needs. Therefore, the current generation has to leave the planet in a state that can continue carrying the activities of the people living in the future. For example, the Sustainable Development Goal number 14 is life below water, a world in which 30% of the fisheries are overexploited, in which whale fish captures have stagnated since the 1990s, and in which economic incentives are driving fish species to extinction is unsustainable. To put sustainability and CSR in context, we can have a look at what happened in the last 40 years. We have seen that close to 14,000 organizations, according to some estimations, worldwide, have published a sustainability or CSR report. Before that date, there were also different kind of social reports, but they were not called in this way. But in about the same time period, we have gone from consuming 1.16 to 1.69 Earths, according to the estimations of the Ecological Footprint Network. In the same period, per capita electricity consumption has doubled from 1,500 kilowatts to more than 3,000. The share of renewable energy in the same period has remained fairly stable, at around 18%. As a consequence of the use of non-renewable sources of energy, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased from 340 to 403 parts per million. And if we think in biodiversity, according to the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, more than a quarter of the known species are threatened with extinction. Therefore, in terms of global ecology, the publication of companies of those sustainability reports has not been matched by substantial changes in sustainability. At the same time, global population has increased from 4.5 to 7.5 billion. The share of global income has increased by 4% for the top 1%, and has increased only 1% for the bottom 50%. According to the International Labour Organization, there are still 200 million children exploited and 40 million slaves engaged in different forms of forced labor, and human trafficking. Again, the interest in sustainability and the publication of sustainability reports by organizations has not been matched with sufficient social progress. We cannot put 100% of the blame for those global processes on the organizations and companies, but organizations are key actors in many of them, and reaching sustainability requires the contribution of businesses, or maybe the rethinking the way business is conducted. I will mention two examples in which business organizations are important players in those global processes. The first example has to do with modern-day slavery. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva launched in 2005 a National Slave Eradication Pact, which has been signed by many companies. As part of this initiative, there is a dirt list of companies profiting from slavery. Journalists report that by 2011, about 40 Brazilian workshops in Zara's supply chain were found by authorities to be employing people under slavery or close to slavery conditions. Different countries, such as the UK or France, have legislated on modern slavery, and it is important to note here that corporate reporting about the supply chain is one of the main mechanisms devised to fight such practices. Here lies an accounting question, because setting the boundaries of corporate responsibility and accountability is something where accounting technologies does play an important role. In this regard, we have suggested elsewhere that most of the research in sustainability accounting is doing a sociology of preparers. Rob Gray and Richard Laughlin complain that such research is unconnected with the fundamental sustainability issues. And the irony is that sociologists and geographers are those who are interested in the details of accounting. Referring to the case of carbon markets, it was a sociologist, Donald Mackenzie, who stressed the importance of accounting technologies. Making, and I quote, making carbon markets more effective is crucial, and the esoteric nature of the politics means that researchers have a particular salient role to play in bringing to light matters of apparent detail, accounting, that in fact play a critical role in this respect, critical roles in this respect. The second example I will mention is the importance of global fishing companies for the sustainability of global marine ecosystems. I already provide some information showing that the exploitation of the global fisheries is unsustainable. The decline of marine ecosystem has already been studied by natural scientists. We have enough information to conclude that the fishing business model needs to change. There is also sufficient knowledge about the economic dynamics that lead fisheries to overexploitation and eventually to collapse. However, the translation of this ecological and economic knowledge to actual decision and at the policy making and business decision levels is problematic. In order to understand this process, and this is the illustration, a group of researchers of the University of Stockholm Brazilian Center, led by Henrik Osterblom, studied the role of large seafood companies in this process. In their investigation, they identified 13 companies that have a key role in the most profitable global fisheries. This world map is represented in circles the main fisheries and the participation of those 13 companies. The details are not important. It's the idea that the scientific background of most of these researchers is ecology, and they used a concept drawn from ecology, keystone, to refer to those companies, and this is the title of their paper, Transnational Corporations as Keystone Actors in Marine Ecosystems. The notion of keystones refers to species which have an impact over their ecosystems that is disproportionate relative to their abundance. The question is, how can information about ecosystem decline and unsustainability guide decisions at the policy making and business levels? There are accounting questions in this area. One intent in this particular case is the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which is in the slide. This initiative results from a series of keystone dialogues between scientists and seafood companies to use scientific information to transform the global seafood system. And there are accounting technologies like reporting engaged in this process in studying the connection between science and business, between science and the social science, between what we know about the ecological sustainability and the actions that are required at the business level. A key answer to the challenge of sustainable development is the relationship between natural science and society, as I said before. It is in this regard that the notion of the Anthropocene provides a new perspective. In 2000, the Nobel Prize winner, Paul Crutzen, in a discussion, in a conference, is said to have coined this term. The notion of the Anthropocene suggests that humankind is not just affecting or modifying the natural environment. It has emerged as an ecological force sufficient to name a new interval in geological history. This figure is an update of a study published by Rockstrom and other scientists in Nature, assessing whether some of the most important ecological processes are inside the limits of the carrying capacity of the Earth, and the answer for some of them is negative. Some of the processes that are out of control, like biodiversity, nitrogen cycle, land use, or climate change, are among those that will leave a lasting signal in sediments and rocks discernible in the future and justifying the name for a new geological interval. I will follow Cliff Hamilton and his colleagues to illustrate the kind of challenges of the Anthropocene. On the one hand, and illustrated in the case of the global fishing system, human control is not coupled with stewardship and accountability. The accounting academic community will need to explore whether accounting technologies are part of the problem or can be part of the answer to this challenge. Quoting Hamilton, as we appear to have taken control over nature, we also appear ill-equipped to govern the world under the influence of those changes. On the other hand, the Anthropocene questions the distinction between nature and society and demonstrates the ontological limits of the conventional analysis separating both spheres. To sum up, I have tried to provide some historical context, suggesting that non-financial reporting is not so new, some sustainability context to explore the fundamental issues and the role of accounting, and the Anthropocene context to explore the future roles of the accounting academia. Thank you. And now, ciao.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation to this symposium, and also being one of the members of the Corporate Reporting Committee, which is, as Richard mentioned, a new initiative launched by the EAA. And also thank you for coming on this Friday afternoon, sunny in Paphos. But I assume that if you're here, you really want to engage in this debate, so I'll try to make it quite stimulating for you. So, my role here in this panel is to bring some more insights on the academic role, the role of evidence, our researchers in accounting, on the topic of non-financial reporting. So I will start by giving a very ambitious job to give you some brief definitions, sort of going backwards from time, because you will see that a lot of the themes are related to what Mario and Carlos said, but an adapted definition for a definition for sustainability reporting or disclosure or CSR. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Just very simply put, from Bertolo et al. In 2003, the set of information related to a company's past, current, and future CSR or sustainability management activities and performance. So this is relatively a very, very general, broad view, broad definition they brought. Earlier on, there was a definition from Matthews and Peras in the literature. They go into this defining what is traditional versus non-traditional area. So it goes back in hand, and I will show you some examples that this is nothing really new, but even at that time in the mid-90s, disclosing about employees, product, safety, community, or pollution was already considered a non-traditional area. And I will go back to even further earlier in the time from Rob Gray and his colleagues when they sort of created or launched the idea of social environmental accounting. And I just want to focus on the last part about what is social environmental accounting. It is really going beyond providing financial account to the shareholders, but also, as Mario actually pointed out, the Milton Friedman ontology about the role of business in society. Here, clearly, companies have wider roles than providing profits for the shareholders. Okay, so this is the assumptions that this literature, this paradigm, and this community is based on. So I just want to give you a quick primer on that. So in terms of the goal, and I would say even the hope, is that by providing this type of information is to increase the social accountability of business, right? Better information, you would hope or expect that businesses would actually, match and follow through their disclosures. Now, there have been different views on explaining why there are differences in disclosure in terms of CSR and sustainability. The two main theories or group of theory that have been really in the literature, one of them is based on the voluntary disclosure theory, you can call it signaling, and agency theory is based on neoclassic economics. Some of the research that supporting this kind of argument, showing here about the usefulness of such disclosure, and also in terms of the accuracy and the reliability, the transparency of those reports. Okay, so this is a view where CSR information and disclosure is going to be helpful in managing those issues and even create or reduce information asymmetry, being reliable, being useful, etc. On the other hand, as you can imagine, there is really on the end of the spectrum is socio-political theories that have been largely based on sociology and management, so the grouping of political economy theory, stakeholder theory, legitimacy, or under the umbrella of impression management. Basically, the argument is that the firms have an incentive to disclose this information to reduce their exposure. So it's sort of an offset and seen as a legitimacy device or impression management strategy, maybe even a decoupling and some kind of hypocrisy as well going on. So the distinction between what the motivation of the disclosure is really to protect themselves and reduce those risks. There's one really pretty powerful quote from Rob Gray in 2006 is that the vast majority of reporting is basically voluntary, partial, and mostly trivial, and with such data, no reader could make any kind of reliable estimate of the company's social and environmental performance. That goes in sharp contrast with the view that I just showed you. So very, very distinctive views on what is sustainable reporting about. Now, different types of studies have been conducted. Okay, so I'm not gonna, I hesitated to give you a list of references. I don't think it's really relevant here. I'm just gonna tell you briefly. In other words, the type of study we've seen is an attempt to determine whether differences in the level of CSR exposure, sustainability exposure, are associated with difference in disclosure. So when companies are exposed more, what do they, how the disclosure changes, and the main variable, the firm factors that have been found in literature, pretty obvious and now used as control variables, but basically the larger firm that are exposed to sensitive industry, the oil and gas, chemistry, tobacco, you name it, the environmental, socially sensitive industry, media exposures. When those factors are there, there are much higher probability that the firms will disclose more about the social and environmental issues, again, for reason of legitimacy. Different types of study would be changes study. So if any changes in exposures lead to any changes to disclosure practices. Okay, so that's sort of interesting because you can also look at, on a time scale, what type of exposure have potentially led to those disclosure changes as well. So for example, if you go back to the, in the US, Ronald Reagan's deregulation policies, when that policy or that exposure political regime was in place, well, you've seen a decrease on disclosure because there was not much governmental monitoring and control and influence. On the other hand, when you have such a disasters, you have the Exxon Valdez oil spill or the Total oil spill, or even recently you have the hurricane, catastrophic, etc., you see generally a huge increase in the environmental disclosure sort of after the event. Fukushima, for example, another one recently. And then other ones such as environmental legislation, such as Superfund exposures, will lead to mitigating environmental disclosures as well. And last but not least, and I'm not saying this is a complete list, but we have a study that, does anybody care out there? Like, who reads the disclosure? Does it really matter for the users who are reading and potentially using this disclosure for their decisions? It has been relatively mixed in the literature. So we have seen some cross-sectional study looking at market reaction to, again, catastrophic events such as the Bhopal chemical leak, the Alaskan oil spill, and they found that consistently find prior disclosure, if you had disclosure before those events, then you'll have basically less severe negative market adjustments, and also that it is actually associated with reputation. So obviously you have market reaction, and you have also from the societal or stakeholder perception that there is a reputation effect as well. Okay, but again, there is no clear evidence of which way these are going as well. And finally, more specifically in terms of this debate, there's the debate between what companies are doing in terms of the environment, the performance, and the environmental disclosure. And one side, you can imagine, as I mentioned, voluntary disclosure is talking about, well, when the firms are using a superior strategy, they just want to show, and you'll find a positive relationship. And if you have a poor performers in terms of environment, you will find firms that are increasing the disclosure significantly, so you have a negative relationship. Basically, poor performers disclose more. Okay, so these are the debate that we have in the literature. Now, I'm going to rely heavily on my good friend and co-author. He had actually delivered this as part of the speech at a plenary, and then wrote a paper on this in 2013, and this is, to me, still valid. So he's talking about waves in this type of research. So the first wave, back in the 70s, it was really about exploring the expansion of this type of accounting. So as Mary mentioned, this is nothing new. We go back to the 70s, you can see a study on human resources, on social effects, and corporate social responsibility. Okay? The second wave goes a little bit more into market reaction type of studies. So market reaction to social disclosure, performance, user perception, and the relation between environmental performance and environmental and financial performance and disclosure. Okay, so a little bit more specific study, more regression-based and quantitative study as well. And he mentioned also, and this is really credit to him, like there is a kind of ripple in the middle where there is some kind of focus all of a sudden on environmental disclosure, market valuation, market reaction, environmental liability, environmental costing. And then here comes the new wave. Okay, so the new wave, which you will see quite critical of, is that this recent phenomenon of having all of a sudden CSR research appearing in these major journals, we call them, or top tier journal. It is, also due to the fact that reporting has become a standalone practice, and we have now maybe more ways to capture the data. Methodology becomes a bit more accessible, etc. So the new wave, which we call recently study, CSR reports, geography employee disclosure, anti-corruption disclosure, and then you have all these topics called CSR and something. Okay, so you have CSR and earnings management, CSR and insider trading, CSR and signaling performance, and then you have also, I'll get into more details, some of more research opportunities published in the accounting review, shareholder activism, etc. You have seen that the evolution of this CSR research has become quite financial based when you look at especially those topics. And this is what we're going to observe, that recently in this mainstream research journal as agenda, we just want to label it that this is a rediscovery of CSR. Because, as I will mention earlier, some of the research that's been done earlier in the 70s and 80s has basically not been recognized very much. Okay, so in 2006, in the Journal of Accountancy, you have Balu et al. 2008, the Accounting Review from Simet et al. And Accounting Review 2011, special issue or special forum on Accounting Review on CSR and accounting, special issue in the Auditing Journal, and a conference at the Harvard Business School with JAE on CSR accounting. Okay. So the biggest concern we have is basically Dan Patton, myself, and Robin Roberts we are North Americans, and we observe this phenomenon happen. And we have actually some problem with that. Okay? Why? Well, because we have noticed that these papers that I've just cited and many more have basically ignored and dismissed all the literature that's been done in the last basically 30 to 40 years. Okay? Basically selling old wine in new bottles. Right? But what was even more striking is that actually these authors in 2012 at least know about this, right? So this is what they put. Of course, there are many other earlier CSR studies published in the Accounting Review and in many other accounting journals. We do not cite such papers because this commentary is not intended to provide a review of prior CSR work, but rather to comment on how accounting research do that, etc. This is in the footnote, okay, in the Accounting Review editorial. Our other concern is that not only this is a matter of papers cited or anything, it's also looking at who was invited, because I think this was a special issue with commission papers. Who was invited to write for this commentary? So I'm just going to read this quote because it's pretty powerful. Robin Roberts has written a commentary in CPA in 2018. As Moser and Martin articulate the argument of a broader perspective, However, they are dismissive of extremely relevant stream of research necessary in staking out the existing boundary of the CSR accounting research domain. I will also mention that Moser and Martin thank several excellent scholars in their acknowledgements, but none of them has a long history of publishing CSR research. So why not ask CSR accounting scholars such as Rob Gray, Dave Owen, Jane Babington, Carol Adams, Lee Parker, James Guthrie, Jesse Diller, Dan Patton, Charles Cho, Craig Deegan, Michel Magnan, Denis Cormier, Roger Barrett, Jeffrey Uneman, Brendan Dwyer, Marcus Milne, Stefan Schalteger. Their work counted the hundreds of thousands of articles. I mean, Rob Gray by himself has hundreds of articles. It's 100,000 Google citations, okay? And think about this. Imagine the European Accounting Review having a forum on earnings management, yet ignoring all of the earnings management scholarship produced in CAR, TAR, JAR, and JAE, okay? So this is not a declaration of battle of war of paradigm shift, but this is just a matter of trying to recognize prior evidence, prior research. I mean, this is, some of the scholars have, this is the entire career to this research. So to finish, what is even worse is that they don't even cite the papers from priors in their own journals, okay? So it is really an issue when you have CSR research in mainstream journal that really focus on financial issues, market relevance, market valuations. This is useful, but this is really what it has become about on the evidence. So we do have a problem with sort of have a complete picture of what the academic evidence is, okay? So to quote again, I think it was Dan, this perspective can only hinder the ultimate development for better accounting disclosure for all the impact of business because you are taking such a narrow view of accounting and ignoring what else has been done in the past. So, this is my statement. To me, it is crucial, highly important, imperative that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing CSR research now, but you need to be a lot more open, transparent, and ethical in terms of citation scholarship. I mean, I've shown you an example of what, this footnote is, and still today you will see paper after paper who just ignore research that's been published, obviously not in their journal or the TAR, CAR, the family. No, there's research journals out there, AOS, AAAJ, CPA, JB, Accounting Forum, many papers, many research on that, a huge community. I mean, we have also a community called CSER, the Center of Social and Environmental Accounting Research, which is also, basically dedicating the entire mission to this research. So this is my message to say the role of academic evidence, okay, is important, but it can be very hindered when you have a very, very biased view of what research is. Okay? So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. It's really a pleasure and honor to be representing the CRC of the European Accounting Association. I'm going to present to introduce the new committee. But given the time, given this is the last session of the last day, and I'm the last speaker, I'm going to be really brief in order to have time to discuss and to make questions later if you want. And before starting, I also want to thank you very much for being here. I see a very, well, that there is a lot of interest in this topic given the number of people that are now in the session. So given that I'm going to present the Corporate Reporting Committee, I will go directly to the presentation. First, I'm going to introduce it, then I will talk about the scope of the group, then the output we have had so far and our projects for the future, the organization of the Corporate Reporting Committee, and I will conclude with some final comments to give the starting point to the audience. Well, this committee, the Corporate Reporting Committee, is the new EAA committee. It was launched or created in February 2019, 19, yes. And this committee, together with the Financial Reporting Standards Committee, tries to bring contributions to the standard setters about the evidence-based research that academics have made previously. So the idea is that we are going to transfer our knowledge to the standard setters. Both committees, the Corporate Reporting Committee and the Financial Reporting Standards Committee, are behind or below the umbrella of the Accounting Standards Committee that is chaired by Richard Barker. The focus of the new committee is the wider corporate reporting. So our committee covered everything with the exception of financial reporting. So it has different names: non-financial reporting, integrated reporting, CSR, sustainability reporting, etc. And because of that, well, as you have had here a clear view about it, there are many, many things that are part of our mission. So we had to cover a lot of topics, from sustainability or from natural resources up to social, non-financial, to talking about intellectual or intangibles, etc., or governance. In addition, we also have to deal with a number of different stakeholders. So it's not only focused on the investors, as it happens with the Financial Reporting Standards Committee, but with information to any interested stakeholder. Due to the scope of the committee is focused initially in providing answers or replying to the stakeholders that had been. Wait a minute. Yes, that have been asking for comments or questions. But what the real issue nowadays is that most of the current regulatory proposals are related to investors. Therefore, it is relatively natural that our interests in some cases are focused on investors due to this is the main focus of attention of those that are producing standards or guidelines. We also have a concern about a number of different topics. I already mentioned that. So it's not only environmental or sustainability, but also other things such as intellectual capital, human capital, etc. And in contact with the Financial Reporting Standards Committee, the Corporate Reporting Committee is not aligned with any particular standard setter. So the main aim of the Financial Reporting Committee has been, considering or taking into account the comments of the ISB or the European Commission, but in this case we are not aligned, so we have to react or respond or influence or provide our ideas or views to a different group of stakeholders or associations, sorry. In the only case of the ISB, we have to take into account the management commentary, given that this is more considered a non-financial topic itself. So we have to. This is part of our mission to react, to respond, the ISB, on this aspect. So far, the committee, since February that we started to work, has produced already 2 common letters. The first one was the response to the EC consultation on the update of the non-binding guidelines on non-financial reporting, which relates to the directive on transparency. But that particular document was focused on climate-related information. So we reacted to that. The deadline was 20th of March, but in that month we could do a very detailed and interesting and relevant response, I guess, I hope. Then we also reacted to the Financial Reporting Council, UK Financial Reporting Council on business reporting of intangibles, some realistic proposals. But the deadline was the 30th of April, so some days ago. And so, as you see, it's a completely different topic. We were talking about how intangibles should be reported in the balance sheet, more or less, or in the notes. So we had to discuss and provide our view about that. In addition, these are the two things we have already done, the 2 common letters, and in the future we plan to provide also some other responses to other requests of comments. But we also have in mind, we had the first meeting took place, our first physical meeting took place yesterday in the morning, and we considered the possibility, and we are planning to do, producing papers by the CRC on some policy relevant topics. For that things, we could perhaps, ask for some ad hoc people, ad hoc groups, in order to have a better informed group for the particular topic we want to do. But we have not made any decision about what we are going to do just now. In addition, we are also using the EAA ARC website, and we are going to use the blog that is in that website. So far, I only sent a message at the beginning informing about the creation of the new group, and Charles Cho, who is a member of the reporting committee, also included an interesting document 2 days ago or so, and I invite you to read it. But we are planning to include not the letters that we send, complete letters, but summaries of the letters, in order to make you know what we are saying about the different topics when we reply letters. It could be also the case that we have organized some symposiums or workshops in the future, but we have not have the time to think about all these details just by the moment. Regarding the organization of the group, well, this is similar to the Financial Reporting Standards Committee. We also have a permanent group, but different to that committee that is made of 5 people. In our group, we have 10. So it's a double size, which is an obvious, I would say, an obvious due to the different topics we are going to deal with, the different associations, the different stakeholders we have to take into account. So the size is relatively big. In order to decide the members of the group, there was a call for proposals or nominations, and there were 35 candidates. That clearly shows how important is this for the community, for the EAA community. So we had to make a decision, difficult decision, I must say, because all the candidates were really potentially good for the committee, but we had to select a reasonable number. But we hope that other people, there will be a replacement, and there will be other people that will work with us in particular things in the future. In order to produce these common letters I was mentioning before, we try to form small groups that deal with a particular topic. Then they produce a sort of draft letter. Then we discuss among the group, have a sort of voting, which is not a real voting system, but we try to achieve a conclusion that satisfies all of us before sending the letters in the name of the CRC. And if you want to work with us or offer your time in order to do something in the future, you can have you have my email address here in the slide, but also in the website of the EAA, so you can contact me or any member of the group, of course, and then we will keep that in mind for the future. About the members, I already said we are 10, so I will mention, well, first Charles Cho, who is he's sitting in the table, so you know him perfectly. Then Liz Demers, both are, Liz is in Los Angeles, is moving to outside of Europe, so they are the 2 non-European members, which means that we have a very international group. Then we have myself, Laura Girella, Peter Cajuter, Lucia Lima Rodriguez, Peter Pope, Gunnar Grimmel, Ricardo Estaccini, and Ian Thompson. As you see here, if you know some of them or most of them, they represent, well, for sure, different nationalities, different universities, different approaches in research, in methodologies, and different gender. So we try to have a wide group that represents EAA and people interested in this topics. Well, before concluding, I just want to make a couple of comments, or three, I don't know, about the future and about my personal doubts about the future, about the non-financial reporting, about what we can do. So first thing is to mention that this idea of having a committee on non-financial reporting or a corporate reporting committee that was decided by the management committee of the association, I think it was a really good decision. It goes in line with the tendency that nowadays we are seeing that financial and non-financial reporting is considered, is required, is given by companies, by organizations, to the extent they are useful for the stakeholders. So this is something important to, I think it was a really good idea of the association to do that. Given the nature of the group and the mission we have, I think we have to work closely with the Financial Reporting Standards Committee in many topics, not always, but in some occasions, so we will do it for sure. In my view, it is the frontier between the assets and liabilities, which is the financial information that we have been accustomed to deal with, and some non-financial information is, well, it's an accounting convention. I think Mario mentioned that as well in his words before. There are, in the case of intangibles, this is pretty clear. If they are in the balance sheet or not, that depends on an accounting convention. And the document we replied on financial reporting to the Financial Reporting Council was about that. It's non-financial if it is not in the balance sheet. It's financial if it is there. But really, this could change. Then also about environmental, social, corruption risks. Well, as long as they are really real risks for a company and they could be affect the financial position, they will be liabilities. Therefore, again, we are close to that side, but depends on many things that we are not under our control nowadays. But the link or the difference is also in accounting convention. So where do we put the frontier or the limit? Then, well, there are other documents that I particularly think was a clear case, a clear example of this closely financial versus non-financial idea. IFRIC 3 on emissions right, it was, at that time, it was a clear movement towards including assets and liabilities in the balance sheet. But this document was withdrawn later on due to a number of reasons. So, but it was not so obvious that they should not be in the balance sheet, but they are not. Regarding another thing about what sort of information should be provided by companies, no matter if it is financial or non-financial. Well, I think it's important to think about the role of information. So far, we have had the idea, or I have had the idea, that accounting or financial information should give a neutral view of the company and, without trying to influence companies' behavior. But this looks the other way around, or it could look the other way around. So it looks as if the purpose of this non-financial information is precisely that, changes firms' behavior and improve social welfare or making business more sustainable. So I think this is like a sort of change of paradigm. What are we trying to do now with the information? Well, I have borrowed the words of Charles in the blog that he wrote this recently, because I think it fits here. Despite the substantial body of research that the role that sustainability disclosures can play in any transition towards a less unsustainable society remains unclear. So it's not obvious that this pressure to provide information on a voluntary basis is going to be successful to achieve changes. But in any case, I want to highlight that in my understanding, this is like a change, important change. First, information should not change companies' behavior, it's only capturing what they do. Now it seems information has to make changes in the company's behavior. And then the other question that I just have in mind is about what is the purpose of the information, if it is helping to make decisions, but now it's not only to investors, it's for all the stakeholders. And it's not obvious that thinking about one group or another group is always going to satisfy all the needs of all of them. As I said before, most of the current documents on non-financial reporting are written thinking in the investors. So they are thinking about investors' needs, and because of that, they should, companies or organizations should provide some information. I'm not sure if this is really what other users want, other users need about the information of organizations. So I don't know if these questions go in the same line or they could bring to different answers, but in any case, the purpose of the committee that I am representing and chairing is more, in principle, providing, reacting to the requests of opinions from the academics, but also we also try to do serious research or promote serious research in order to bring the academic view to the society. And that's all I want to tell today. Thank you very much for your attention, for being here, and I'll go back to my place. Thank you.
We have time for questions and answers. Could you keep your questions brief, please, and only ask one question each, okay? And no speeches, right? And so I'd like to suggest we get questions in batches of 3. There's a microphone over here, I think. So wait for the microphone to reach you. Who would like to ask a question, both about the substantial topic of research, but also how to get involved in the committee's work? So on anything we've covered. There's one right at the far corner, just to give you some exercise. Have we got any more questions to take? Any more hands at this stage? There's another one in the middle over here.
Thank you. I'm Juhani Vaivio from the Aalto University School of Business in Helsinki, Finland. Even at the risk of being slightly polemical, let's backtrack to what I heard in the beginning, that it's not about shareholder value, it's about stakeholders, it's about non-financial information. Before we sort of subscribe to the idea that it's not about shareholder value, so let me pause for a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very easy to dislike the shareholder capitalist, the one who drives a Porsche or is about to step into a stretched Cadillac in Wall Street, the obnoxious figure. We're happy to agree on that. Now, Karl Marx said that, the people who cannot represent themselves must be represented. So I want to represent here the tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions of ordinary workers, the contemporary proletariat. Somebody who has managed to maybe after 40 years of work save something like 20 or 30,000, buy some shares, or maybe go to the stock market through a mutual fund. Ladies and gentlemen on the podium, are we telling to such a person who's been waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, working his or her butts out, that here now it's not your time to wait for some return for your investment. Now it's your turn to be ecological, responsible and social. What do you think, ladies and gentlemen?
I'm not sure what the question, there was a speech, but I'm not sure what the question is. Does anybody want to have a go?
I think to the extent that I understand your question, it was hard to hear because of the sound system. But I think you're kind of echoing the point I was trying to make. We get into this kind of binary that, we either go 100% for the stakeholder and, we vilify the shareholder, or we go the other extreme and we pretend like there's no one else but the shareholder. And the reality is the world doesn't work like that. And we have a responsibility as people who are thought leaders in the financial system to make that system work better for all people. If we're not doing that, I don't know what we're doing. So to an extent, I agree with you in that we can't just keep avoiding that question because, you know, JAR will only publish things with lots of maths and that is based on neoclassical economics, which has been discredited by many economists. I don't know whether I answered your question or not.
There's another question down here.
So I want to ask a less grand question, and it's in some ways it's about the framing of the EAA initiative. So why corporate reporting? So first of all, corporate. There are many other entities in the world, and I'm particularly conscious of government accounting. I think this is really an area that needs to be attended to. And also reporting. Are we focused on reporting or acting? Acting? So I think that it seems a little bit sad in some ways that we would limit our attention to corporations and to reporting.
Okay, that's a sufficiently difficult and challenging question, and I'm going to ask Begonia to answer it.
I think it's not fair to launch me the question because I didn't choose the title. Frankly, if it would be Corporate Reporting Committee, this would be in the top. This is the Non-Financial Reporting Committee. This is the way I would title it, if I can, the Non-Financial Reporting Committee. Because the other, and then shares with the Financial Reporting Committee, and we form the total committee, which could be the corporate and non-corporate other organizations. But if I had to choose the title, I would have called it the Non-Financial Reporting Committee. But I didn't choose the other one as well, so I cannot give you an answer for that, sorry. I agree that I don't like the title, full stop.
Can I give you an answer as an EAA member, not a member of the committee? I think we're being very imprecise with our language here, and we need to clarify that. There are kind of three forms of reporting. There's reporting that's required under companies' legislation, and that's typically called an annual report. And the front part of that report now has a lot of ESG type information. It's no longer voluntary. The Non-Financial Reporting Directive in Europe made that compulsory. So I think we need to change how we think, whether we're talking about that, because that is a responsibility of the board. The directors have a legal responsibility for that information. Then there is voluntary reporting, which is typically about reputation. The quality of it is no good, and those quotes that I think was from Rob Gray, nothing's much changed because we do a review of about 200 reports every year, and they have lots of fantastic photos of really happy children, but not much investors can use. And then the third category is involuntary reporting, an idea John Dumay coined, and that's reporting that you don't have any control over. And so the Zara example we saw, H&M, many others, a lot of the reporting there is people reporting about the company, you know, social media, all of that, which is an area that companies are now very conscious of. But to go back to your point about why reporting, not action, I think there's a desperate need for management accounting to address this. Because when you talk to businesses, they are not going to report stuff that they're not managing. So we're kind of missing a trick here. We kind of keep jumping to reporting, but companies aren't going to report on something they're not managing because that makes them very exposed. And I think the management accounting community needs to really step into this space. I think kind of breaking it up like we keep doing doesn't make sense because that's not the phenomenon of how this is kind of managed in the real world. to the extent there can ever be a real world.
So I think the challenge on the name is fair. It's also difficult to know what else you would call it. It's a very contentious space, this, and anything you come up with is going to be challenged, I think. It reminds me of the famous Churchill quote that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. So maybe that's what we've ended up with. Did you want to say something, Carlos?
Yeah. I mean, I will add non-financial. It's also something a little bit surprising. But I think as I'm talking as a non-committee member as well. I think that this reflects the understanding from a mainstream perspective of sustainability accounting or whatever we call it. But it's difficult to give up a precise number. But I will agree that probably this is just reflecting one activity which has received recently a lot of attention in Europe because of the non-financial reporting directive, and this is probably the reason why this term is used in the committee, because of this directive that is making social and environmental and diversity reporting compulsory for companies above a given level of a given size level.
Okay, just one more comment in that context.
Just quickly to go back to the point you made, David, about the word corporate, which as a CRC member, I didn't choose either the title of the committee. I was happily, accepted to come, but there is always a debate, and totally agree with you that we tend to really focus ourselves on studying, researching, and even teaching at the corporate perspective, but they are the NGO, the government, public sector. So just to give you a brief example, I'm afraid this institution is trying to come up with a name of a center of excellence for something on sustainability. And it took months just to come up with a name that, oh, what about if we do business? No, it's not only about business. So what about the hybrid entities, which are the B Corp or other organizations or government? And it came up with Center of Excellence for Management and Society. It doesn't sound very sexy, but we got rid of the whole entity level from corporate to others, which I think sometimes we need to think about a bit more, from step back and say, this is not only corporations, although it is a powerful institution, but we have other organizations out there. So.
Okay, got another question at the back, in the middle over there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. So if we live in a society where we're almost reaching a tipping point now in terms of the total destruction of everything, the world as we know it, that's the biggest, threat to humanity ever. And if we also live in a world where we live in a kind of a capitalist system which is based on commodity production, that encourages people to just keep buying and wasting more and more and more resources. And we just talk about how we're going to measure and report some kind of corporate activity. Is that just not moving like the Titanic sinking and moving around the deck chairs if we do not talk about serious social, political, economic changes at the same time?
Who would like to take that?
I mean, in my introduction, I was providing some figures about processes that are out of control, and we cannot talk about sustainability. I mean, we have to talk about unsustainability, and the thing from the thing is to what can we do in terms of accounting research? I mean, we can think whether accounting is part of the problem or just part of the problem, can be also part of the solution, or what can we do as researchers? And I have mentioned a few areas in which I think accounting could criticize current practice or propose alternatives. I mentioned the paper by Donald McIntosh in AOS on carbon accounting, and how he develops this idea of how accounting details could have an impact in carbon markets. I don't know whether carbon markets are I don't think carbon markets are the solution for climate change, of course. But again, I mean, this is an accounting question. An accounting question is also to think about boundaries. I'm not talking about reporting boundaries. Reporting boundaries is just a part of, the corporate boundaries. So where supply chains and the example of Sarah. So, I mean, the question is at the end, what can we do as accountants? It's information. Important is information stopping unsustainability in any case. I mean, there are some literature on environmental history showing that some civilizations that collapsed because of environmental issues, they already had information about that. So, it's quite tricky.
We indirectly answer a question or comment. So the role of accounting, we are sort of almost justifying when we ask by non-academics or non in our area, like accounting researchers, how do you make the accounting link with your research in sustainability and CSR? And the biggest component is the disclosure reporting, which in fact we found that it's based on the research we found it's pretty much irrelevant. And I was sort of encouraged recently. I teach this class, sustainability accounting, and they know what it's about. And I teach to the MBA students, and just one quote, one student told me, like, I'm tired of talking, we need to get things going. Okay, so accountants, I think, is a much more important role than focusing on reporting only, and I think we can do more in terms of actions. And we found the research that is sort of decoupled, and maybe we can help bridge that gap between reporting and action. So.
I think that it's fine that we as accountants, we do the financials, and now we are also dealing with the non-financial, but I have the impression that unless we try to measure more all the non-financial things, there is the possibility that other experts take the lead, because where is the advantage of accountants if we don't measure, if we don't put things in the, I would say, the older style, which is the financial. So I think there is the risk that going towards the disclosure side only, then we as accountants lose, well, the right to claim that this is part of our job, because others may have same possibilities or abilities to do it. So I perceive something difficult. And in addition, I really don't completely think, I don't clearly think that going towards the voluntary path by the requiring companies to give information on a more or less voluntary basis, because the directives are compulsory, but the way the things have to be done, it's not so obvious that they're very clear. So I'm not so sure that companies or other organizations are going to change their behavior in that way. So perhaps other means will be much more useful for these things, or introducing more taxations or things like that could be another way of approaching all these problems we are having nowadays, and not only dealing in this voluntary or quasi-compulsory information.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. The first one over here.
Question on how you recognise the quality of non-financial reporting, because I'm struck that everyone on the panel understands the idea of multiple stakeholders using information, and there's discussion about the poor quality of non-financial reporting, referencing Rob Gray, and somebody used the phrase, there's nothing there that investors can use. And I think that's interesting, because investors are only that one narrow stakeholder that all of the financial information has been produced for. And is there a risk that as accountants we will measure the non-financial information as to whether it's useful for us and people like us, and not, I'm wondering if the committee is going to engage with wider stakeholders to see what kind of information do they need, which might not be reported in formats that are familiar to us. It might not look like financial reporting. And the way in which quality information is provided to differently trained stakeholders might need to be quite different. And I'm wondering how the stakeholders might think about that, or the committee rather might think about that.
I think, if I understood correctly, you're trying to ask how do we compare non-financial, or how do we measure sometimes the quality of non-financial versus financial disclosure. So I have an example of a paper I have a problem with, published in AOS in 2008, where Clarkson et al., 2008, proposed a model and results that are opposite of what legitimacy theorists found, using, for example, sorry to use quantitative terms here, but a regression model looking at performance disclosure again, but the entire equation is just the same as a financial disclosure model. And to me, it really bothers me because some of these authors don't understand that there is a huge difference. It's two different animals to talk about, you know, your assets and your liabilities and your profits, and talk about non-financial information, just like the one that I described in my presentation about environment and safety and pollution. And they just measure it the exact same way using the exact same variables. They just change the dependent variable. So there is an issue of this, again, sort of similar to what I was talking about earlier, that there is this misconception that, oh yeah, we're just going to add the non in front of financial, and then we're just going to run everything as it is. And we found this new variable in this database because we have CSR, sustainability, matrix that we can just plug the variables. So the way that we measure things, that's why sometimes methodology, you have to be a lot more open to say maybe this kind of information can be measured both qualitatively in an in-depth manner, interpretivist, and maybe in addition quantitative. But what's happening in what I described is that none of this is happening. It's just like another variable because, wow, this is a new database we found that nobody ever saw. And you saw like how it's been ignored. So this is a big problem for me to make this huge, like perfect analogy that, okay, it's just like without numbers, we have information on pollution, or we have information on CO2 emissions, which are not accompanied by dollar amounts, but we're just going to code it as a variable. And that's what, the problem arises.
Okay, very briefly, final question.
Just bearing in mind that the current remit of the committee is to respond to exposure drafts, consultations, and so on, I'm just wondering if the committee has put some thoughts on which type of drafts or consultation that it would respond to. So just thinking about a very recent example, the management commentary proposal, IFRS, it was packaged with other type of proposal as well, the disclosure initiative on materiality. So the management commentary bit was specifically on non-financial reporting, but the disclosure initiative bit was related to broader financial reporting elements. So I'm just wondering whether the committee is going to respond just on the specific non-financial reporting projects, or is it going to address the broader financial reporting potentially?
Okay. So Begonia, I think final comment for you on the focus of the committee.
Well, the focus of the committee is dealing with any the short term, dealing with trying to give responses or react to the standard setters that produce something which is related with non-financial disclosure, non-financial reporting. If this is about principles of disclosure related to non-financials, this is part of our mission as well. If it is referred to management commentary, which is considered non-financial, this is also for us. Of course, if the Financial Reporting Standards Committee wants to say something, we can talk to them and see which is their views about it. Because at the end, what we want to give is the results of our research as a community to the standard setters. If it comes from one committee or another committee, personally, I don't think there is an issue. We have to give the view of the EAA at the very end. But if you ask me what we have to do, in principle, we focus exclusively in non-financial reporting, no matter which is the institution that produces the call and produces the standard or the guidelines or whatever they do.
Okay, so we're finished. I'd just like to say great thanks to Begonia and to Charles, to Carlos and to Mario, and thank you to everybody for coming along. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, team.
Thank you. It was very interesting. The first question was great.